The old man in the faded gray windbreaker had been standing at the host stand of the Camellia Room for almost 5 minutes, and Trevor Ashford had decided he wasn't going to give him a sixth. "Sir." Trevor came around the podium with that smile he used on people he intended to get rid of. "I think there's been some confusion. This is a fine dining establishment. We have a dress code. We have a reservation system." He let his eyes travel down the windbreaker, the corduroy pants gone shiny at the knees, the scuffed brown shoes. "We're fully committed tonight. I'm sure there's a nice place down on Market Street that's more your speed." The old man said very quietly that he had a reservation under the name Russell. Trevor didn't even look at the screen. "I don't see it." He picked up the small canvas tote the man had set on the corner of the podium and held it out at arm's length, the way you'd hold something you found in the gutter. "And you can't leave this here. We've got real guests coming through." He didn't hand it back. He sort of tossed it toward the man's chest, and the old man's hands weren't quick anymore, and the tote hit the marble floor and spilled. A pair of reading glasses skidded under the bench. A church bulletin folded into quarters, and a small framed photograph slid out and landed face down on the polished stone, the cardboard backing splitting along one corner. The whole front room went quiet the way a room does when something has gone wrong. And 11 minutes after that, Trevor Ashford would be standing in the kitchen pantry, with his back against the dry storage shelves, the color draining out of his face so fast that the line cook would later swear. He watched the man turn the gray of wet newspaper, because a 23-year-old server had just leaned in and told him exactly who the old man in the windbreaker was. "Let me take you back, though, because the photograph on the floor matters, and the man matters. And you can't understand what happened in that pantry unless you understand what Russell had buried, and how recently." His full name was Russell Avery Whitman, and 3 days before this, he had turned 68 in an empty house on Sullivan's Island with a piece of grocery store cake and a candle he didn't light. Margaret would have made a fuss. 41 years she made a fuss over his birthday, every single one. Even the year's money was so tight, they were splitting a single plate at the Waffle House and calling it a date. She died 14 months ago. Pancreatic, the fast kind, 8 weeks from the first stomachache to the last morning. And before her, 11 years before, there'd been Tommy, their boy, 26, and gone in the time it takes a pickup to cross a center line on Highway 17. The windbreaker Russell wore into the Camellia Room. That night had been Tommy's. It still smelled like nothing now, but for a long time it had smelled like him, and Russell had worn it until it didn't, and then he kept wearing it anyway. So that's who was standing at the host stand, a man who had been handed about as much grief as one heart is built to carry. Here is the part Trevor Ashford did not know, the part nobody at the Camellia Room knew, because Russell had made sure of it. 43 years earlier, Russell and Margaret had opened a 12-stool diner on the wrong end of King Street, the end nobody walked to, with a fryer they bought used, and a hand-lettered sign that said simply Whitman's. They served eggs and grits, and a shrimp plate Margaret's grandmother had taught her, and they treated every soul who came through that door, the bankers and the bus drivers, the tourists and the men who slept under the crosstown, like that person was the most important guest they'd ever had. That was the whole philosophy. Margaret used to say it plain. You do not get to decide who deserves to be treated like a human being. That's not your job. Your job is just to do it. The diner became 2 diners. 2 became a barbecue joint, then an oyster house on Shem Creek, then a little empire of them up and down the Carolina coast. By the time Russell was 60, Whitman Hospitality Group ran 19 restaurants and employed 1,100 people, and Russell had never once put his face on a menu or a wall, because he didn't want anybody being nice to him for the wrong reason. He drove a 15-year-old Camry. He flew coach. And 4 or 5 times a year, he did a thing his executives called, half affectionately, the ghost walk. He'd put on Tommy's windbreaker and walk into one of his own restaurants, or one his company was thinking about buying, and he'd sit there as nobody at all. and he would watch how his people treated the person who looked like he couldn't afford to be there, because anybody can be gracious to a man in a good suit. Russell wanted to know what his restaurants did to the man in the windbreaker. The Camellia Room was not yet his. Not that night. It was the oldest fine dining room in Charleston, 90 years on the same corner south of Broad, white tablecloths and a 100-year-old crystal chandelier, and a reputation that had been slowly rotting for a decade. The family that founded it had sold to investors. The investors had run it into debt. And on Monday morning, 2.5 days from that Friday night, Whitman Hospitality Group was set to close on buying it, gut the management, and bring it back. Russell had spent a week reading the books and the Yelp reviews and the 11 separate complaints in the personnel file of one Trevor Ashford, general manager. Hired 18 months prior, 4 written warnings. 0 consequences. He didn't come that night to gather more evidence. He had plenty. He came because Margaret had proposed to him in that dining room. 1979. He was a busboy there for one summer, the only summer, before he got fired for sitting down to eat with a regular who'd had a stroke and couldn't lift his own fork. Margaret was a hostess. On his last night, she walked him out to the corner of Church Street and told him she'd marry him, that she'd already decided, that he could argue if he wanted, but it wouldn't change anything. He'd carried that corner in his chest for 50 years. And when his lawyers put the Camellia Room on the list of acquisition targets, Russell looked at the name a long time, and then he said yes. Buy it, and he booked a table for one under his first name only, because he wanted to sit in that room one more time before it became his, and order the shrimp and tell Maggie, wherever she was, that they'd come all the way back around. That was the plan. A quiet supper and a private goodbye. He never got the supper. He'd called ahead. The reservation was real. It was sitting right there in the system under Russell, party of 1, 7:15. Trevor Ashford simply didn't look, because Trevor had taken one glance at the windbreaker and the worn shoes and made up his mind, the way men like Trevor always do, in the first half second, on the only information they think they need. So picture the front room, the chandelier, the murmur of money, a Friday in October with the windows fogging against the first cool night of the year, and a 68-year-old widower bending down on bad knees to gather his glasses and his church bulletin and the photograph of his dead wife off a floor, while the general manager stood over him and said, loud enough for 2 tables to hear, "Some people just have no concept of where they belong." Russell picked up the frame. He turned it over. The crack ran right across the corner of the glass, through the white border, not across her face. And he was grateful for that in a way that didn't have any words. It was the picture from their 40th anniversary. Maggie laughing at something he'd said on the dock at Shem Creek, the sun behind her. He wiped the dust off the glass with his thumb. He folded the church bulletin and put it back in the tote. He stood up slow, one hand on the bench. And here is the thing I want you to sit with, because it's the thing the comments always come back to. He did not yell. He did not say a word about who he was. He had every card in the deck. He owned the building 3 days from now. He owned the man's paycheck. He could have ended Trevor Ashford's career with one sentence. And he didn't reach for any of it. He just looked at Trevor for a long moment, the way you'd look at a storm coming in off the water, with a kind of tired recognition, and he said, "I'll be on my way." He almost made it to the door. A young woman was crossing the front room with a tray of waters, and she nearly walked into him. And she stopped to apologize, and then she looked at his face. Really looked. Her name was Daniela Reyes, 23, 2 years on the floor at the Camellia Room, putting herself through the College of Charleston one semester at a time. And something behind her eyes went very still. 6 months earlier, Daniela had driven 3 hours to Columbia for a regional hospitality conference. The kind her manager said was a waste of a Saturday. She'd gone anyway because there was free professional development, and she needed it for a scholarship application. The keynote that morning had been given by an old man in a plain blue jacket who walked out with no notes and talked for half an hour about a diner on King Street and a woman named Margaret and the one rule that had built 19 restaurants. Daniela had cried in the third row and hadn't been able to say exactly why. She'd kept the program. It was pinned to the corkboard over her desk, next to her class schedule. Russell A. Whitman, founder and chairman, Whitman Hospitality Group. The man in the windbreaker, reaching for the brass door handle, was him. Daniela set her tray down on the nearest service station without looking where it landed. A glass tipped. She didn't notice. She walked fast across the dining room to where Trevor was already turning back toward the kitchen, satisfied, brushing his hands together like he'd taken out the trash, and she caught his sleeve. "Mr. Ashford." Her voice had gone strange and thin. "That man, the one you need to come here now." Trevor pulled his arm free, annoyed. "Daniela, I'm handling. That's Russell Whitman." She said it so quietly that he had to read her lips for half of it. "That's the chairman. That's the man who's buying us on Monday. That's our owner." I have tried, telling this story, to find the right way to describe what happened to Trevor Ashford's face, and the truest version comes from Andre Boudreau, the head chef, who came out of the kitchen at the wrong moment and saw the whole thing. Andre had cooked at Whitman's original King Street diner as a line cook in his 20s, 25 years back. He knew exactly who Russell was, and he'd been keeping it to himself for months because Russell had asked him to. Andre said Trevor's face didn't go pale all at once. He said it left in stages. The color drained off his forehead first, then his cheeks, then his lips, until what was left was the wet gray of an oyster shell, and his mouth opened and nothing came out of it at all. He turned. Russell was standing at the door with the tote bag against his chest, looking back at the room, just looking. At the chandelier and the white cloths in the corner of Church Street you could see through the glass. Trevor crossed the floor too fast, almost tripping on the edge of a rug, his whole body suddenly arranged into apology. "Mr. Whitman, sir, there's been a terrible, I didn't realize if I'd had any idea who you." And Russell turned and looked at him, and he said the only hard thing he said all night, and he said it gently, which made it worse. "That's the trouble, son." He shifted the bag on his shoulder. "You shouldn't have needed to know who I was." Then he opened the door himself, because no one had thought to open it for him, and he stepped out into the cool Charleston dark, and the door swung shut behind him, and Trevor Ashford stood in the middle of the most beautiful dining room south of Broad Street, with his career going down through the floor like water through a cracked hull. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that was the justice. The face, the dawning horror, the boss revealed. That's where these stories usually end, with the bully realizing what he's done. But that's not justice. That's just embarrassment. Justice is what came after, and it was bigger than Trevor, because Trevor was never really the whole problem. Trevor was a symptom. Let me tell you what Russell did, because it tells you everything about the man. He did not call his lawyers from the parking lot. He didn't post anything. He drove the Camry back over the Ravenel Bridge to Sullivan's Island, the lights of the harbor sliding by on his left, and he sat in his kitchen with Maggie's photograph propped against the salt shaker, and he didn't sleep much. And in the morning he called Gloria Marsh, his chief operating officer of 20 years, and he told her two things. The first was, "The deal closes Monday like we planned, no change." The second was, "Before we put $1 into the dining room, I want to know how many people that man hurt that I never sat across from." So Gloria pulled the thread, and Lord, did it unravel. It started with the personnel file, the 11 complaints that had gone nowhere, but the file was only the part that got written down, and most of it never did. Gloria and her team spent that weekend on the phone, and the stories came in like a tide. There was Harriet Voss, 81. Who'd saved up to take her late husband's sister to the Camellia Room for the sister's 90th birthday, and whom Trevor had seated by the kitchen door, and then, when she asked politely to move, had told that the better tables were held for people who come here regularly. Both women had eaten quickly and left, and never spoken of it to anyone, the way that generation often doesn't, until Gloria's call gave Harriet permission. Harriet cried on the phone. She said she'd spent a year thinking maybe she really didn't belong in a place like that. There was Dwight Coleman, a Vietnam veteran who'd come in wearing his old field jacket on the anniversary of the day his unit was overrun. The one day a year he let himself remember out loud, and Trevor had asked him to remove the jacket because it wasn't appropriate for the room. And when Dwight wouldn't, Trevor had him walked out by a busser. Dwight told Gloria he hadn't been to a restaurant since. There was a young man named Marcus who was deaf, and who'd tried to order by pointing at the menu and typing on his phone, and whom Trevor had loudly called a problem in front of his own date. And there were the people Trevor was supposed to be leading. 2 former servers, both let go, both of whom Daniela had watched get fired for things that weren't their fault. A busser named Keisha Tolliver, 19, whom Trevor had docked a shift's pay for attitude, after she gently corrected a customer who'd grabbed her wrist. Andre the chef said the kitchen had a name for the way Trevor treated the floor staff. They called it the King Street treatment, which was a cruel joke, because none of them knew that King Street was where the man who actually signed their checks had started out, bussing tables and getting fired for kindness. 5 complaints in the file, 11 more that weren't. A pattern as old and as plain as the building itself. And every single time, somebody above Trevor had looked at it and decided it was cheaper to keep him than to do the hard thing. Until the man in the windbreaker walked through the door. Here's the piece that turned it from a quiet internal matter into something the whole country watched. Remember the room going silent when the photograph hit the floor? There'd been a woman at table 9 that night, a regular, 84 years old, named Ruth Ainsley, who'd been coming to the Camellia Room since Eisenhower, and who had watched Trevor Ashford treat human beings like furniture for a year and a half, and had finally had enough. Ruth had taken out her phone. She'd learned to use the camera from her great-granddaughter, and she had recorded the whole thing, all of it, from the moment Trevor came around the podium to the moment the old man let himself out the door. 2 minutes and 50 seconds, steady as anything, an 84-year-old's hand that did not shake. Ruth didn't post it that night either. She thought about it, and on Sunday afternoon, before she knew anything about who the old man was, before any of it had come out, she put it on her grandson's account with one line. This happened Friday, at a restaurant I have loved for 60 years. I am ashamed I sat there. I should have stood up. It had 400,000 views by Sunday night. It had 9 million by Monday noon. And what made people lose their minds was the part nobody had told them yet. That the man being thrown out was the man who, that very morning, had walked into the lawyer's office in Tommy's windbreaker and signed papers, and become, at 9:42 a.m. on Monday, the legal owner of the restaurant that had treated him like garbage. That afternoon, the company released one short statement. It didn't use the words zero tolerance because Russell hated corporate language. It said, "We failed Mr. Coleman. Mrs. Voss did out himself." It said, "and others whose names we will never know," long before we failed our own chairman. The difference is that he had the power to make us listen. They didn't. That is the failure we intend to fix. Trevor's Ashford was terminated Monday at 10:33 minutes after Russell owned the building. He was not walked out for show. Russell wouldn't allow a spectacle. He was simply, quietly finished. The industry is small in a town like Charleston. He did not find another front-of-house job in the Low Country. And then Russell did the thing that I think is the real heart of all of it, the thing the bigger headlines mostly missed. He found them, the ones whose names the company hadn't known. He went, in person, in the same windbreaker, to a little brick house in North Charleston where Harriet Voss lived alone. And he sat at her kitchen table and let her make him weak coffee. And he told her she had belonged in that dining room more than any man who'd ever worn a tie in it. He took Dwight Coleman to dinner at the Camellia Room himself. The two of them at the best table in the house, Dwight in the same field jacket. And Russell told the staff that the jacket was the finest thing anyone would wear in that room all year, and he meant it, and they could see he meant it. He tracked down the deaf young man, Marcus, and hired him, Not as charity, as a host, because the boy was sharp and warm, and the company was about to need people who understood that not everyone communicates the same way. And Daniela Reyes, the 23-year-old, who had set down her tray and crossed the room and said the words that broke the whole thing open. Russell paid the rest of her tuition. All of it. When she tried to thank him, when she started to cry and say she'd only done what anyone would do, Russell stopped her. He told her that was the saddest part, that she thought it was nothing. He told her that 20 other people in that room had recognized that something was wrong, and that she was the only one who'd moved her feet. Recognizing wrong, he said, isn't worth a thing. Lots of people recognize wrong. The whole game is whether you move your feet. There's a part of this I almost left out, because it's small, and then I realized it's the part Russell would have said mattered most. There was a young woman at table 6 that Friday night, a tourist from Ohio named Hannah, 26, in town for a wedding, who had watched the whole thing and who, alone in that whole rich, quiet room, had stood up while the old man was still on his knees gathering his glasses. Before anyone knew anything, Hannah had pushed back her chair and said, out loud, "Sir, let me help you." And she had crossed the floor and knelt down on the marble in her good dress and handed him his church bulletin, and she had looked up at Trevor Ashford and said, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Just that. Then she'd helped the old man to his feet, and she'd told him there was a seat at her table if he wanted it, and Russell had thanked her and said no, he'd best be going, and squeezed her hand. She had no idea who he was, that's the thing. She didn't stand up because the man was powerful. She stood up when he was, as far as she knew, nobody at all. A poor old man in a cheap jacket being humiliated by a man in a suit. She had nothing to gain and a scene to lose, and she moved her feet anyway. When the story broke, and Hannah's face turned up in Ruth's video, reporters found her back in Ohio and asked her why she did it. She seemed confused by the question. She said, because he was somebody's father. And then she said the line that ended up on 100,000 shares. You don't help people because of who they turn out to be. You help them because of who you already are. Russell flew her and her mother to Charleston as his guests. He told her she'd done at table 6 for free, with nothing to gain, the exact thing he'd spent 40 years and 19 restaurants trying to teach people to do. She was, he said, the whole point. So where is everybody now? Let me tell you, because I think you've earned it. The camellia room reopened in the spring, restored down to the plaster, the 100-year-old chandelier taken down and cleaned crystal by crystal. Russell kept the name, but he hung one new thing in the entry, where every guest and every employee passes it on the way in, a framed photograph of a woman laughing on a dock with the sun behind her, and under it, on a small brass plate, a single line. You do not get to decide who deserves to be treated like a human being. M.W. The staff started calling it on their own, without being asked, the Maggie Standard. New hires learn it the first day. The first lesson, every time, before they ever touch a plate. You will treat the man in the windbreaker exactly the way you treat the man in the suit, and if you can't do that, this is not the job for you. Within 2 years, every restaurant in the company had the same photograph by the door, and 3 other hospitality groups in the Southeast had quietly copied the practice, and the trade magazines wrote it up, and somebody tried to call it the Whitman method, and Russell hated that, the same way he'd have hated being on a menu. Daniela Reyes graduated. She runs the front of the house at the Shem Creek Oyster Place now, the one on the water, and she trains every new server herself. She still has that conference program framed now in her office. Dwight Coleman eats at the Camellia Room on the second Friday of every month. They hold his table. He wears the jacket. Nobody has ever asked him to take it off again. Harriet Voss passed away the next winter, peacefully, at 82. At her funeral, her niece told the small crowd that the last good year of Harriet's life had started the day a man in a windbreaker knocked on her door and drank her coffee and told her she'd always belonged. Russell was in the back pew. He'd driven himself. And Trevor Ashford? Last anyone heard, he'd left the restaurant business altogether. Moved up north. There's no big ending for Trevor, No courtroom, no ruin. Just a man who had a kind of power for a year and a half, and used it to make small people feel smaller, and then lost it in 11 minutes to an old man who never raised his voice. His name comes up sometimes in the training sessions now, but they don't even use it. They just say, "Don't be the man at the host stand." Everybody knows who they mean. Russell Whitman still drives the Camry. He still wears the windbreaker. He still does the ghost walk, 4 or 5 times a year, into his own restaurants, sitting in the back in his dead son's jacket, watching how his people treat the person who looks like he can't afford to be there. He says he'll do it until he can't anymore. He says it's the only performance review that's ever told him the truth. I want to say one last thing to you directly, because I've been standing outside this story the whole time, and I don't want to leave without stepping in. I've thought a lot about that half second, the one where Trevor looked at the windbreaker and the worn shoes and decided. We all have that half second every day about somebody. The cashier, the man at the off-ramp, the old woman counting change at the front of the line. And I used to think the test of a person was what they did when they knew someone was important. I had it backwards. The test is what you do in the half second before you know anything at all. When there's no boss to impress, no camera, no chairman about to be revealed. When the person in front of you is, as far as you can tell, nobody. Because here's what Russell understood that Trevor never will. Everyone is somebody's Maggie. Everyone in that windbreaker is carrying a corner of Church Street in their chest, a dead son's smell fading out of the fabric, a whole life you will never see the shape of. You don't get to decide whose grief counts. You don't get to rank the souls coming through the door. And if the only thing keeping you decent is the fear that the old man might turn out to own the building, then you were never decent. You were just lucky he hadn't shown up yet. So move your feet. When you see it, whatever it is, the small cruelty, the quiet humiliation, the man on his knees on the marble floor, don't sit there waiting to find out if he matters. Stand up while he's still nobody. That's the only kind of standing up that ever counted. Somebody filmed it once. Somebody stood up once. And a man got his dignity handed back to him on a cold night in Charleston. Not because of who he turned out to be, but because, in a room full of people who looked away, 2 of them remembered who they already were.